Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, but mostly happy Friday. I'm Kyler Cheatham from The Confidential, and I am your host today. Apologies, we're a few minutes late, totally my fault. I was reading an amazing case study that our team put together for this live. So I wanted to be sure that we got all that information in there when it comes to how you actually use AI agents to produce value in your organization. And so today we're kind of going to go through the hype around AI agents and how to know what you're buying or what you're building, right? So, as always, I'm joined by Adam Cheatham, which I'll let him say good morning, introduce himself here in just a second. But before we do, let's hammer through some of just a logistics. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining. We're really happy to have you. Every Friday, we go through what we're actually seeing in the marketplace when it comes to what our clients and our community is experiencing. And we just have an informal conversation around that. So I invite you to put your feedback questions in the comments wherever you're joining from. It aggregates right here, and we can see all of those. We often bring them up, talk about them, because this is just our experience. Your experience is just as important. So just to test that feature, I'd love to know where you're joining us from today and what your experience has been around AI agents. So with that, good morning, Adam.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. This is always a fun conversation to talk about AI agents, not because that's what everybody talks about, but because all of those conversations have this sense of AI is going to do all these great and wonderful things. And then there's a reality that sets in. And I like to liken this to the thought process of ERP as well, because I think that there's a lot that can be gained from that. And every client has a life cycle on what they think ERP can do. I'll use this as an example. And at first, there's kind of this I don't really know what ERP is. And there's a low level of maturity. And so there's a scale on this, right? And then as the client learns that ERP can do more and they learn more about it, well, ERP can do this, ERP can do this, ERP can do this. And this thought process, well, wow, it can do so much. And that this bucket of things starts to grow up, all of the things that ERP can do. And then you reach a point in that maturity curve where you also then start realizing what it can't. And I think that we're starting to be as a marketplace in general on the reality of that back end. What can't AI do? What are the limitations in it? And that's something that I think is important to talk about as we go through this conversation, because there are still lots of people that are on the look at all the great and wonderful things that AI can do, but haven't reached that point where they know enough about it
Yeah,
to
yeah,
understand the limitations.
for sure. And have a use case for it, right? A lot of times when we talk about AI, we start with the solution, right? We want AI. Okay,
Mhm.
why though? Like what is the problem you're trying to solve in the organization? What value is that actually going to bring? And I
Yeah.
think that's a big piece because we kind of have like this tale of two AIs, right? We have fear and we have hype. Right. And it's very difficult to get in between that and actually say, like, what is specifically our AI agents doing and how is that going to be adding value to our organization?
Yeah.
I think those are kind of two pieces that you really need to look at in this conversation to really ensure that you know what you're doing.
When you're 100% right on that, I think that there also comes this conversation of what do we have that we can work with and what do we not, right? And we've
Exactly.
been
Good point.
having conversations about our Jeeps, for example, and tire size and lift kits and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, a Wrangler can do quite a lot. And I have to continue to remind myself sometimes, like it actually can probably do the things that I'm trying to add things on to do with it, right? Do I need to be able to drive straight up a mountain, literally, in some of those videos where it's like an 85% incline? No, I don't
Hmm.
have to do that, especially with children in the car. Are you for real? Although my son would probably love it, he would probably
For sure.
um, be very much on the. It's not bumpy enough. That's his thing. It's the road. It's not bumpy enough, Dad. It needs more bumps. But at the end of the day, I use that example as it's always worth knowing what you have and what you can do with that before you start pouring on extra stuff. Because one, you start to court the idea of, are we just spending a bunch of money on things that we don't need? That's in some cases the best case scenario. In other cases, it's are we starting to piece together some type of a Frankenstein vehicle or system that starts to that we're pulling apart what are natural geometries in a vehicle and
Mhm.
changing them the same way we're pulling apart natural integrations that are working today in a system and we're
Mhm.
changing them. And the
Yeah.
more we change those things, the more those small differences start to become exacerbated. So I think that that's a really great example of how you should think about AI agents. What do you need, and then
Yeah.
what do you already have as well, so that you know
Right.
what you're going to get out of it.
So let's dig into that. And I see a lot of these questions in the comments, and I think this will help kind of answer some of the what are AI agents questions, right? So what are AI agents actually? So it's not just like bots running wild amongst your plant floor, right? It's not like drones flying everywhere, like pop culture would like you to believe. We're not talking about Iron Man here, right? We're talking about specific agents with defined job. Like one watches, one analyzes, one adjusts, one experiments, right?
Yeah.
And they all work together inside a certain rule based system. And as I always say, these should be the most boring parts of your organization, right? Because they are very rule based. So I think that's a good definition in how to define them. When we talk about AI agents, typically we're talking about the analysis and overall statistics of machine learning.
Yeah.
And that's what really we talk about. And these are there Gen AI agents? Are there chatbots? For sure. But when we talk about actually adding true value to the organization, we need to be looking at, hey, where are these areas in which we can deploy an agent that's going to help us on the side of variances? And we will talk a little bit about one of our agents that we utilize so that you can kind of get an idea of what we use.
Yeah.
But I think that's a big piece of this question. When people ask for AI, be specific about it. Are you talking about generative AI? Are you talking about neural networks, machine learning, predictive analytics? And you're wanting AI to do what exactly and why, right? So,
So every time I see neural network, I always think of the Terminator. That my CPU is a neural net processor. It's just funny. The way that the world has understood this topic of AI for decades already is just sometimes ironic to me. But when Avery's 100% right on this, though, when you think about what are you actually asking for, right? In which pieces? Yeah, you could be asking for all of those things at the same time, and that's different than asking for one of them. Yeah,
mhm,
so the way that we've constructed it, I'll give you an example. Um, our proof of concept agent is a catapult agent.
mhm,
I like this case study because it's simple and identifiable. And the idea is, if you have a catapult, everybody knows what a catapult is, right? You have a catapult and you need to hit a certain distance. I'm not talking about max distance. I'm talking about a specific distance because that's more
mhm.
identifiable from a manufacturing perspective. I need to, yes, greatest movie of all time, possibly.
Why
But
do you guys encourage him? Like, honestly.
because they because they should. It's encourageable, right? So it's relatable. It's part of the concept. I mean, if you can't talk about AI without somebody saying, "Is Skynet taking over the world?" Nobody talks about the Matrix. That's all AI too, but Terminator comes up first because for a good reason. Anyway, as I digress, come back to the concept of the catapult, right? We need to be able to hit a specific target within a range, right? Not as far as we can go, because if you ramp up all of your machinery to output as much as it can, as fast as it can, for as quickly as possible, then you're gonna max out your equipment. You're gonna have breakages that are akin to trying to drive 65 miles an hour on the highway in first gear, right? It's just you can't do it. But how do we find that optimum space where we can hit this number reliably and within an acceptable amount of variability, right? And of course, catapults, if you throw a catapult enough times, you will realize that it's not exactly the same every time, which is fine. That's the whole point of the model. And within that variability, you have the concept of what happens when things like the elastic band starts to wear, or if you're outdoors, wind picks up, it starts to rain, this, that, and the other. Maybe it's a headwind, maybe it's not. But measuring distance in this space is important so that we can say we're outside of our acceptable limits. And if we're outside of our acceptable limits, how do we make corrections when we should? And just as importantly, how do we not make corrections when it's not that big a deal, right? When we think about it, we have to understand those scenarios in manufacturing as well. So if we start to have this drift where our distance is lowering little by little, we're probably seeing some type of a wear on the elastic, right? So maybe it's time to replace that because we're not able to hit our targets appropriately, or maybe we change the bucket position in the launch angle for at least a little while to get a little bit more out of it, right? Our AI agent is able to do that. And the way that we constructed this was by using a real database on actual catapult throws, creating a digital twin of a catapult, and then using that to figure out what it is our agent can look like, what our upper and lower limits are. We use machine learning to identify those upper and lower limits and our capacity for hitting them consistently. And then we have agents who start to do things like, and what's important about this is there's more than one agent involved in this, right? One agent is purely responsible for saying, are we inside of our upper and lower limits? And then there's another agent that's responsible for saying, what should we do about it?
Exactly.
Anything, nothing. What are the corrections that we should make? And so in this whole scenario, we're using machine learning. We've run a design of experiments to understand what the upper and lower limits ought to be, and we have multiple agents. This is not we're just using AI for it. We have a particular approach to it that is structured and is a system. And that systems-based approach, I think, applies to so many things that underlies the complexity in all of what we're talking about here, whether it's ERP, AI, Jeeps, catapults, whatever. They're all systems that I think need to be diagnosed in a way that understands the relationships between all the bits and pieces.
Yeah, and I think the importance of that awesome case study you just laid out is like this is controlled autonomy, right? So autonomous process control using AI agents, right? So it's not just free roaming
Yes.
AI that you just plugged in all over, and it's certainly not just a GPT wrap, right? And I think a lot of times what we're seeing right now, especially in the rise of people trying to get on the bandwagon to sell you AI agents, a lot of those are just wrappers. And
Yeah.
that is really what you have to understand in these things. What are you building on? And what
Yeah.
is your control over that?
What's your actual
Right?
model? What model are you using? Because there is one behind it. And I think that one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is which AI tools ought you be using. And we
Exactly.
use a number of them, right? We use OpenAI, we use Perplexity, we use Claude, we use Copilot, and the number of scenarios starts to expand. What I think is going to be an interesting thing is to see what happens as this curve of knowing what AI does and what it doesn't do starts to flatten. What typically follows in that space is industry consolidation, right? So you have this scenario. My favorite example of this is Teams, and we're at the beginning of the pandemic. Zoom was the absolute jam of the world. It was thriving. Like Zoom did everything. Everybody was on Zoom. The initial question was, well, everybody has Teams already. Why are we not using it? Like, well, we use Zoom, or we use Cisco, or we use Blue Jeans, or we use GoToMeeting, and you have all of these different scenarios where this fragmented industry had a clear leader, and it had bits and pieces. And then the pandemic happens, and somebody like Microsoft goes and says, "Well, you're already paying for our stuff. What if we just fix it?"
Kind of. Like, let's be generous on fix it. Okay.
Well, how many people use Zoom right now? I would venture a guess to say, and my camera's got
Maybe
close
you
to
should use Zoom right now if you're
well, restream is my problem at the moment because my camera's out of focus. But my challenge with it is if you're using Zoom today, you don't have the same level of access as everybody else who's using Teams. And it just is what it is. Everybody uses Teams. It's built into all of the Microsoft Office suite, and Teams has taken over the video conferencing space. And that happened within a year or so, right? I think that what we're going to see here is that same type of consolidation. I'm not saying that people don't use Zoom. People still use Zoom, but the days where I'm on literally Zoom one meeting, Teams another meeting, Google Meet a different meeting, WebEx another different meeting. In all this scenario, you throw in another rando like Blue Jeans and stuff like that, and those days are gone. Like if I'm on more than 2 platforms in a day, that's a busy day for my
Yeah.
webcam. I think that's going to happen with AI agents and AI systems. I'm blanking on the word, but the models that we're using, AI models, is it ChatGPT? Is it Perplexity? Is it this or that? And I think what will happen is, I promise you, whether right now, everybody that's listening to this is at least on a PC and maybe not a Mac. Everybody has a little button at the bottom of their screen that is Copilot. It's already there, right? You're going to start realizing, companies are going to start realizing, I already have Copilot. I'm already paying for it. Why should I pay for something else? And then Microsoft is going to say, oh, by the way, we don't only do one model like all these other ones. You use ChatGPT for this, you use Perplexity for that, you use Claude for this. We actually have models for each of those.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the Copilot's going to take over this conversation.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest advantage in this, hold on, I want to finish this because I'm on a soapbox and I like it. The challenge that I think that other engines are going to have is going to be with data and data protections, right? No other company can already say, well, you're using Excel, right? Don't you export every stinking thing you do from one system or another into a spreadsheet? We're already showing you that we can protect your data. Your data is in Excel on the Microsoft cloud somewhere. All of it in one way or another. ChatGPT that'll live in the same space as Copilot. ChatGPT can't say that. Perplexity can't say that. And they'll say, well, we'll give you an enterprise license, but it's not already there. You'll pay more for it. And I think that's where this is going to come into a consolidation. But that's a prediction. We'll see if I'm right this time next year. But who knows? Anyway, so I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. I think that's an important prediction. I think that's important as people have all kind of this disparity of products that they're trying to navigate, right? Thinking about what works within your suite, but also, we have this, SaaS mafia, as I always call it, that will legit block your data. So, you're talking about Copilot, which can be helpful on kind of the front end for things, a variety of different things. When we're talking about like heavy manufacturing agents, I mean, I still kind of lean towards the build your own, right? Like build your own and leverage that internal controls. Do you see that as something that would match the same sort of structure process you had with, an SAP, an IFS, a more of a core operations focused system?
Well, I think that there are a number of things that she said that need to be pulled apart in it. Number one, These SaaS-based systems, as much as they want to tell you in the sales cycle that you own your own data, you go and you read through it, and you do not have the access to it that you think that they're conveying that you would, right? The bigger the system, the less access that you're going to have to it from a perspective of what happens if I want to pull it out of this system. And that's important because what they're then using that for is it's the same, it follows the same multi-tenant platform concept where you build something in tier one ERP. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, whatever. That code is shared on a multi-tenant platform. It doesn't mean that anybody can access your instance within that, but it does mean that you guys are sharing something. And that data is a part of that shared scenario, that shared content, shared environment, right? It all lives in that ERP space somewhere, and their AIs learn from your data. So when you start thinking about building your own and what you want to have in there, there's some of your data doesn't matter to the rest of the world. It's not proprietary, whether or not they know, especially for publicly traded organizations, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's anonymized throughout the year and then you report it out quarterly, is it that big of a deal if it's part of the shared knowledge space, right? Probably not, especially since when you report it to the markets, it goes on the internet, and now it's wildly public for all AI systems, right? So there's some of that doesn't matter, but there's some of that does. And so when you think about building your own, the way that I consider it is what does matter and what doesn't, and how do we make sure that we're building models and workflows that support our internal needs on what we need to be proprietary to us. And this is what I think is important in this is you can do that in a number of different ways, but you build workflows in it. And we use N8N to build these workflows, and we really like it. But the actual AI model, the algorithms, and all that stuff is one part of the workflow, right? You have the whole system itself and the different agents that fit into that workflow in different spaces built into N8N. So when you ask it to do this, tell me what this answer is. And then if this answer is this, go to that agent. If the answer is that, go to the other one. And those agents might be powered by different engines. And right now, what I think is happening is, someone says, do I need to code something new? Okay, if I'm going to code something new, and that needs to go to probably Claude, something like that, that's a bit more oriented towards that. If I need to generate new content, that goes to ChatGPT, goes to OpenAI. And there are different tools that make different decisions within AI that enable agents differently. And this is where I think that the thought process of Copilot is really going to start sticking a bit better because Copilot does have the capacity to have different types of agents with different quote unquote skill sets. The same way individual programs have different types of skill sets. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that and a lot to be recognized in the space where if that in the scenario where you had to have different decisions go to different agents. And now you got, let's say you have Claude and OpenAI in there. Now your data's in both of those.
Yeah.
So that now we've got to think about how do we protect it from this one, how do we protect it from that one, and what do we protect from each. Whereas if you're using Microsoft, it's a little bit different story because it can all be in one. So I'm not saying that I at all think that would push Microsoft over any particular AI model right now. Just kind of thinking out loud from a perspective of if individual tools specialize in different types of agents and you have one that can actually do more than one type, there's a difference in value in that from a perspective of protecting your data.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I think it's so cyclical to how big software operates, right? Um, in the fact, I got a question yesterday on our TikTok live about AI agents of like, do you think that these bigger systems will start to integrate with each other? And it's like, well, I think they'll say they'll integrate with each other, but it's not in their best interest, right? To integrate with another system that they don't have a license for, right?
Yeah.
Or they're not getting that subscription fee for. So if they're big enough, they'll just build their own and make you use it, right? And you don't have to use it. Like they certainly aren't going to lock you in their basement, but they'll lock a lot of things up that makes it very difficult for you to put it in your architecture and have a flow at the enterprise level. So,
Yeah. Well, I
you know,
think the best example of that is, 10 years ago, every single ERP, 10 years ago, every single ERP provider had a standard integration with Salesforce. Standard. Out of the box is pre-built and it was designed to hook up to Salesforce. Because if you didn't hook up to Salesforce, you didn't win the business. Everybody was using Salesforce. And it just was that way. Now, what happened in that scenario is each of those larger providers then said, well, there's a chunk of money that Salesforce is taking that we should go after. And they built their own CRM following the Salesforce model, where now each of those large providers says, we do that. You can't. And then what's interesting is how almost overnight the conversation flipped from, yeah, dude, everybody, we integrate with Salesforce. That's easy
yeah.
to. What are you talking about? You can't integrate with Salesforce. That's impossible. Nobody does that.
And how ridiculous that you would even suggest such a thing.
Right. So, and I think that where you're at in that conversation is right now, that conversation would be like, yes, all of these agents can talk to each other. All these models can be compatible. But I think what will happen is there will be some sense of consolidation. What a big deal it would be if OpenAI bought Perplexity, for example. Those types of things, and you have that consolidation, because they're certainly not going to buy Gemini, and those types of things. But what happens when the market consolidates? Because it will. It always does.
Yeah.
And then when they start buying each other up, ERP providers will buy some of them. Here's a great. What happens if SAP buys Perplexity? Now that's even more interesting, right? And this is the way software works, where if somebody does something that you think is valuable, or is at least more valuable to them than it is to you, and is costing you business, you go buy them. And
yeah,
so
always. Yeah.
A lot of that will start happening here very soon.
Looking at you, NetSuite, right? Who's not Oracle, who doesn't want to say they're Oracle, but they are. Well, so I think this is helpful when it comes to like market predictions. Let's kind of shift to, if you're looking at building an agent, introducing an agent, where are we starting, right? Like, where are we starting to not go down the fear route, not go down the hype route? And how are we building a business case or understanding where an agent can fit in the business?
Yeah, always with the business case, right? What business value is this going to add, right? At the end of the day, so it's funny. Who was I talking to? Oh, I have a friend that works at City of Denver. City of Denver has decided to use more AI. And I said, all right, what does that mean? He goes, we're going to use AI. Great. This is going to be fun to watch. Let's follow up on this as it goes, because they're just going to use it, right? Like, what does that mean? They haven't answered the question, and they're early in this decision-making journey. So I think that there's still time for them to start piecing this together, and that you ask the question, all right, we know that we have a tool that we should be using. How do we use it to create value, right? That's the part of it. What value are we seeking to gain in this? It's the same as we've identified a brand new market that our product can be used in. How do we identify the value we can provide to that market? And how do we then cater our product to serving that? Whether it already does quite well and we just have to be able to tell people and communicate it, or we've got to make some specific tweaks to be competitive in this industry. Same conversation. How are we going to use AI to create value? What is the value we seek to create? And then pick a piece of it, right? Don't go for all of it. AI is small enough, AI is nimble enough where you can pick a piece of it and you can take a bite and say, we're going to add value here, and we're going to build one small piece of it. And then we're going to add on to that, and we're going to add on to that, and have a roadmap for it, right? When you start road mapping out your processes, and this is where we expect AI to add value, that's where you get more prescriptive. And now we can dig in and say, now, if I'm going to add value here, I am going to decrease the amount of whip between this step of the process and this step of the process. Because for whatever reason, we have this massive amount of work in product process inventory that sits here. It costs us an inordinate amount of money for all of that to sit there. And we need to figure out how to take that particular step and shrink the work in process inventory. How do we do that? Now we can put an AI agent towards it. Okay. So what is our throughput on the step before? What's our intake on the step after? Right. Maybe it's just simply that we're putting out too much here and we're not able to take that amount of inventory there. Maybe there's a step in there that's an inefficiency that for whatever reason we're changing things over differently. We have too many change outs that cause this second step to take more time to step back up and to open back up and start over again. How do we reduce that work in process inventory? Now we can look at the data on both ends of it. We can create a machine learning model that says, all right, here are all of the variables. And then I can create an agent that says, what are the scenarios where this side of it works differently, that side of it works differently, and how can I increase either how can I match the throughput of step one with the intake of step two? And now we are getting down into the weeds, right? So we're starting to figure out how this is coming together. It's not we're going to build a model and we're going to plug an AI in and it's going to tell us the answers to that. It will have no idea what to do with it. It will have all this data and nothing that provides context in a way that says this is what that means for your process. And that's how I would start that type of a conversation when somebody says, I want to use AI. You have to start with, for what value? You can't just say we're going to use it and it's going to make us better. That's just not going to work. I promise you, it will add value in some places, but it will also add value in other places that aren't as important to you at best, or add quote unquote value in areas that are actually contradictory to your purpose.
I like this question here. How do you decide what's too complex, especially in heavy industry that we work in, that's too complex for an AI agent?
How do you define what's the difference between one task and the next? That's how I would think about that. An AI agent should be task specific. I have one job. This agent's job is to do one thing. It's not to plan and execute, it's to simply plan. And then there's another agent that communicates to a different agent what the execution plan will be. And then a third agent, which is designed to actually execute. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds redundant. But what's important is that the context of each of these agents, the space that its quote unquote brain operates in, needs to be simple, predictable, and reliable. This is part of how we eliminate the issue of hallucinations. You create a strict context. Then that way this agent's not thinking about all this stuff over here that it doesn't have context or data on. It's in a scenario where it operates in a nice, neat little box. And so in order to do that, we break it up. What I love about this part of this question is that it fits so well into project management. How do you break a project down into tasks and action items on who's going to do what? You should do the same thing with your AI agent workflows. What is each individual task? And then how can an agent enable that singular task? And maybe you have 10 tasks and you have 10 agents. Maybe you have 10 tasks and you have 15 agents because you need an agent to move each task to the other one. And then you actually have to have a 16th agent whose job is to facilitate that actual process flow. And that's all they're supposed to do, move one thing from one step to the other. This is a part of the architecting of the AI agent network that you should be building. There's not one agent.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, to my point, the most boring part of your organization, right? And when we start to talk about it in that way, we start to think of less kind of magic of that we're going to use AI to be better. Okay, well, in just saying that, you are worse because you don't know at all like what time and resources you're bringing to your organization to produce that value. We're going to use AI agents to better understand traffic signaling. I
Yeah.
don't know, right? Like in a public sector, there's many things that you can do, obviously, with AI agents, but not understanding that I think is our biggest challenge when it comes to especially executive team and leadership teams. So that brings me to my next question. What happens when you don't have an executive team at all that understands this type of, and I would say for 90% of, larger businesses, that is the truth. And so what are you doing to kind of bridge that gap between, hey, you told us to do AI, right? This is where we found the most value as the project leadership team, even as, the director network tier of the organization. How are you going to explain to the executive team in that devil's triangle, right? That we always talk about
Mm.
leadership point,
Yeah.
um, IT in the business. How are you going to explain to the leadership team that this is important and they need to get behind it?
I think that the best way to do that is well, the leadership team is supposed to be able to provide you an idea on where that value is going to come from, right? That concept of we're going to use AI to create this value. They should be able to provide you with some guidance on where they expect that to happen, right? Um, a leadership team that says go use AI is not doing their job, right? That's they're not creating a cohesive enough strategy that can be understood and executed upon. They are exacerbating the gaps in the devil's triangle. But when they say, at the very least, I want you to use AI to improve our throughput in the operations segment, and I want you to use AI to optimize our supply chain. Now we've got some things that we can tinker with, right? The leadership and procurement can go run with that, and the leadership and manufacturing can go run with that. They should talk, right? Because these things are related. To you can't have throughput if your supply chain stinks. Your throughput's going to slow down, right? You just won't have the input of raw materials to support a high throughput. But there will also be pieces that need to be done independently. So your supply chain needs to connect in a way that is supplying the right raw materials to manufacturing when it needs it. And this is actually probably now that I'm talking through this, the best place to start with that would probably be that connection between supply chain and manufacturing, right? And that would be the first initial point for adding value. How do we make sure at this point we want to optimize our supply chain and we want to maximize our throughput? The place to focus on that, where we can both gain from that and take the simplest case study, is going to be in the availability of raw materials for production. I'm not saying that throughput is only all about supply chain, because then the manufacturing folks
Mhm.
will panic and say that you're putting too much emphasis on this, and the supply chain folks will say you're 100% right. We run the world. The same way sales says we generate all of the income. They're like, right,
Yeah.
but you build nothing.
Yeah.
It's there's a relationship in this, right? But if you focus on that step, and then you say, you take that point and you draw it forward, and the supply chain side of it is to draw it forward in the process to say, okay, I need to know what manufacturing needs and when. So from a production planning and an MRP perspective, demand planning and the like, I can take that engine and I can pick a spot. I can pick one piece of it and say, you know what? Let's take our most critical raw material for our most profitable product, or maybe not most profitable, because we're talking about increasing throughput, our highest quantity produced. Take what we make the most of, and then take our most critical raw material on that. And I want to build an agent that takes the data and creates a model on what does it look like when our raw material um, receipt for that slows down and speeds up. What are the impacts of that? And it may have impacts in lots of places, like inventory storage, especially if it's something that takes up a lot of space. But what happens if I speed that up? And I can optimize that part of it, and I can shrink that part of my supply chain to focus on that. And then manufacturing says, I need that to actually, instead of being as fast as you can bring it, I need it to be at this speed, because if I'm going to optimize throughput, I had to do it at a certain rate. And so optimizing the supply chain side of that has just as much to do with making sure that our what we carry in inventory is not so extensive that we have too much, right? So now we're talking about how supply chain and manufacturing connect together. And now we've taken this thought process where leadership has given clear guidance on, I want you to use it to increase here and here. And now we're having an execution conversation on how we're going to do that. Then we start figuring out we're going to plug agents into it. And this is where IT fits in and says, all right, here is the data that we have. Here is the data that we need. And here are the places where we're going to create a workflow and where we're going to plug in agents that say, once we know what pieces of this puzzle are the most critical. And I promise you, it's not get as much as we can as fast as we can in supply chain. Because if you have so much that you have too much, now all of a sudden we have a different problem, right? Our supply chain isn't optimized. It's become wasteful because we have too much inventory. And that inventory is taking space away from other inventory. So we have an understanding of our process that we can execute on. And then we plug in technology to be able to say, that how do we take all of the math, the physics, and all of those things from manufacturing and all the lead times and everything from supply chain, and we can combine those into a workflow that breaks it down into tasks that can be agentic in nature. And we put an agent here, agent here, agent here. And now we can build a workflow.
Mm-hmm.
Now IT is helping diagnose this, and now our triangle is as small as we can possibly get it. And then we improve, right? Where do we understand how things are working? Monitor it. We're getting better here, but not there. And start building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just there's so much rolled into that there's a level at which like that is so much organization on one part. And I think the agent, at least from my experience, conversation is still tough because does it live with the business or does it live with IT, right? Like you mentioned that IT needs to know the data sets and things like that. But I think that it's a big a lot of things have to align to make it work the way that it's supposed to work, right? And that's why the maturity of the organization is a big piece on that as well. So
Well, I love this question from Stephen on here, where the question is, should teams optimize and standardize their processes first before implementing AI agents? And to a certain extent, yes, right? Your agents aren't going to do a ton if your processes are bad. You're going to have an abundance of bad data that your agents aren't going to be able to do much with. But at the same time, there's a bit of a too much and not enough conversation on this. It goes,
mm-hmm,
it's kind of
exactly.
quid pro quo, right? If you're optimized and standardized, then why do you need an agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of let's get to the point where we have good information and we have good data, right? Let's get to the point where our process is functioning at a high level. And so we have the space to work through additional optimizations that AI agents and automation and those types of things can help with, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can do a lot of damage by plugging AI in too fast because your data is not good enough. And then this is where when your data is bad, like hallucinations are a fact of life in AI, and there's something that are difficult to minimize. And it's always a hard question. So how do I prevent hallucination? Like you don't, but
Yeah.
you keep an eye on things so that when those things do happen, you catch them quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to have human intervention in this process. AI agents can't do everything for
Mm-hmm.
you. But at the end of the day, you have to have a good enough process that is standardized enough for your AI agents to understand it and provide meaningful feedback. that's when they can add value. Then if you do get to the point, and there's another piece of this that's important though. If you do get to the point where you're so optimized and standardized that you're a well oiled, fine-tuned machine and you don't need an AI agent, great.
Yeah.
Like why that's the implementing AI just for the sake of doing it doesn't mean anything. So if you do get to that point, fantastic, good for you. But so I would say that to a certain extent, yes. But at the same time, if you can get to the point where it's fully optimized and fully standardized, then the AI agent provides no value. That's not a bad spot to be in. It's just a different spot. I would
Yeah.
say you can get farther if you standardize to the point where you're reliable, and then you plug in an agent.
Absolutely. I mean, anything that involves AI and automation has to be rule based. So if you don't understand how you do the task,
Yeah.
certainly no piece of technology is going to, no matter if it's an agent or whatever else. I think the way that I look at it from a high level is it's not a replacement of people, right? It's the goal is to take manufacturing from more reactive to intentional, right? So intentionally having guardrails that catch those hallucinations by empowering those human operators to like take a breath. The way I see catapult, if you were here for kind of our catapult, is like that gym on the manufacturing floor that's been there for 40 years, that's cool, calm, and collected, while junior operators are, running around being like, this place is broken. And he can tell from like the hum of the machine if this is just one weird variance that we put out and there needs to be an adjustment and it will fix itself. That's a lot of times how I think of an agent. It's an unemotional, as opposed to a human operator that might overcorrect. And so,
Well,
but
go ahead. Never mind.
I was just going to say, but that has to have process work around it, right? There has to be an understanding of what process you want the AI agent to take over.
Yeah, but I think that a good example in this, maybe maybe this is going away because stick shifts don't exist anymore. But is in a manual transmission car, if you don't know when to switch the gears, there's a piece of that is you got to figure that piece out 1st, right? In order to know how you get from first to second to third in a way that at least gets you moving with the flow of traffic somewhat, you got to know that piece of it first. And you got to know that about your processes, right? Where do those gears change? What are the pieces of it that fit together? And how do you feel your way through that as an organization working through your processes? And then you start thinking, how do I make that better, right? This is where we go from being somebody that knows how to drive a stick shift to somebody who can drive a performance vehicle. Yeah, that's different. And there are different applications in it, right? If I'm driving a sports car, a Corvette, Lamborghini, an M3, whatever, how I drive a stick shift in that scenario is wildly different than how I drive a stick shift in a Jeep off road, right? I need my RPMs to go up quickly after engaging gears fast versus how are you guys AI? I love it. We try our best. Our AI agent is asleep on the chair behind me.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
Just years of experience in our head
right.
just rolling around up there. But thanks for
Um,
asking. People
that's
actually ask me if I'm AI a lot on the internet, and I'm like, what? But
at the end of the day, the purpose is different though, right? If you plugged in an AI agent that drives a race car and you put it in a Jeep, on a stick shift Jeep on a trail, and its purpose is to be a bit more like and I'm gonna butcher this, but I'm gonna do it on purpose. In driving a stick shift on a race car, it's literally boom, boom, right? Your foot comes off the gas and into the clutch and then back on the gas as quickly but as smoothly as possible. In an off-road scenario, you're talking about little bit, right? Your foot comes onto the clutch and you're kind of feathering it a bit. So you are more intentionally deploying a much finer amount of power to your wheels as you're trying to figure out where they are on the trail. Wildly different. You need to know the difference in those things for your business. in that if your process is not optimized or standardized enough to know which one of those scenarios you're in, you're going to have a problem, and you're going to be in a position where you're trying to do something in the wrong direction on your on shifting gears. Now today everything's an automatic, and nobody knows how to drive a stick shift anymore. So maybe maybe that analogy falls flat on at least some of our younger audience. But I think it's a valuable thought process and understanding optimization and
Mhm.
how that happens differently in different scenarios.
Yeah. And definitely something I think you can tell to your executive team, right? When we're talking about like how to explain these types of things. Analogies are actually incredibly helpful because it's still such a new piece of technology. We
Yeah.
have to be able to understand what it looks like. Speaking of that, in the last 5 minutes here, I always want to leave the team with something we can do today, right? Of something that we can look at, we can consider, we can start to move towards. So I think something that I took out of this conversation for sure is, make sure that you're familiar with Copilot. I think everyone, needs to kind of go down that route, and just be aware of what that looks like in any sort of Microsoft
Mhm.
operating system. And then also understanding where agents, not just an AI agent, right? Because there's definitely more than one in these processes, can provide value. With the catapult, we mentioned how we do that through some sort of measuring system, whether it's temperature, distance, all those types of different things. And what that looks like from a variance ratio.
Mhm.
Um, how much of that variance you're comfortable with, how much of it you're not comfortable with, right? And so starting to document those types of things so that you are able to program a role-based agent is going to be a good start. What would you add to that list?
I would say continue to think of all this as a system, right? These are systems with pieces, parts and pieces. And I think that the best way of using this, we've talked in the past about my shoulder injury and how it is I was going to diagnose that and what I was going to do to lean into it. And what I decided to do was start to treat it like a system. And the last time we talked about it, it's been a little while, but was that I was going to kind of lift my way through it. And as I started to do that, I started to think about this system perspective of it, where the pain is in the shoulder, right? But you have different muscles that pull on that same joint. And if you open up that joint a bit, the pain subsides. So my thought process was to start training the muscles that pull on that shoulder. Now, what I did was I did that a little bit too well. So now I've overtrained a particular muscle group, the back of my shoulder blade, because my point was to pull that whole system backwards so that that shoulder joint opened up. And now those back muscles that open up your shoulders by pulling your shoulder blades together were overtrained because the problem was that I didn't give them enough attention in the first place, which is what caused this injury. Now I have a different one that I need to diagnose, and it needs rest. And once it gets rest, I'll take it back a step and I'll start thinking of it a little bit more like that system, right? I need to address both of those pieces now. I certainly can't focus on just the one, middle back muscle and lose the progress that I've gained in my shoulder. But I had to think of them both together now. So now what will end up happening is I'll think about it from a perspective of what muscles pull on both those spots, because you feel it all when you have that type of a middle back tightness and injury. You feel it from your neck down to your lower back. That whole posterior chain is all involved in this. And now it's connected to my shoulder. So I have a little bit of a problem here with starting to figure out how do I strengthen these pieces. And to bring that back to the AI conversation and the process conversation, you can start, and this is where the thought process on the standardizing your process first versus plugging
Mhm.
things in. You can start with one piece of the process and where it is you're going to deploy one agent. But what you're going to find rather quickly is you
Mhm.
can optimize that part of it, and then you're going to pull on strings that are connected to other parts. You got to be able to realize when that's happening. And this is where continuous improvement comes into the conversation, where what you have to do next is identify the strings that you just pulled on and then identify how those are changing and what the impacts are. So as those are spreading through your processes, you're tracking this. And as you turn the
Mhm.
one dial on the AI that you just built, where is it having other impacts? In that systems view, not just a one task, that systems based view, I think, is the most important part of the whole conversation. If you're not looking at it from a systems perspective, you're going to miss some pieces and you're not going to get the value that you think you were looking for.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, the data and controls already exist in your organization, and you're closer than you think. It's more a question if the agent fits or not, and whether or not your team is ready to trust that, right? Those human operators, which is a big part of that process, not just task based, but culture based as well. So, this has been a great conversation. I just want to open it up if anyone has questions, because this is so specific, right, to each organization. Every time we use the catapult, each organization uses it differently. I invite you to shoot us a DM or comment here if you have any additional questions. We always go back in and open those questions and make sure that we're addressing specific concerns. So it's a great opportunity to just kind of ask that in a no pressure environment, right? So we do these every Friday for the most part. So next week we'll be here. We also do 3 TikTok lives a week. If you want a different format to kind of jump in and ask questions, you're welcome to follow me at Kyler Cheatham over there. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for these amazing questions. They really do help the greater community have transparent conversations around this, which is our mission here. Thank you to you, Adam. And I hope everyone has a great long weekend, hopefully. All right.